This video is the second in a series of three, commenting on that illogical nature of p-values according to Wagenmakers et al. This video also has to do with the philosophy of science. So while the previous video focused on discussing whether a probabilistic consequence gets denied in the second premise, in this video I will focus on if it's consistent to transpose the probability of the consequent to the antecedent. I will start with this image that I put here. And as we can see, in this structure of the Modus Tollens, we have the antecedent and the consequent. The second premise relates to the consequent via a negation. So the second premise is there to negate the consequent, and in so doing, then that negation continues onto the antecedent, and the antecedent gets denied in the conclusion. So it's important to notice this relationship. The second premise relates to the consequent via a negation, and in so doing, consequently, the antecedent also gets denied. So first is the consequent that gets denied, then is the antecedent that gets denied. Now, Wagenmakers collaborators basically present syllogism in this fashion. If an individual is a man, this individual will have very low probability of being the Pope. Now we come to know that Francis is the Pope, and we ought to conclude that Francis is probably not a man. Now, let's put, as we did before, numbers to the probability. So let's say 1%. So if an individual is a man, he will have 1% chance of being Pope. So we come to know that Francis is a Pope, and therefore we ought to conclude that Francis is probably not a man. Now, what probability do we attach to this conclusion? To me, it doesn't seem very clear how, in which way or which mechanism exists to transpose the probability of the consequent to the antecedent via the conclusion. So shall we then say that it's a one-to-one transposition, or how does it work? It seems to me that the problem here is not so much to decide about the probability, but to decide whether this transposition of probability is warranted. So if we go back to the formal structure of the Modus Tollens, we can see that again, that is the consequent gets denied by the second premise, and this relationship is just unique between the two of them. There is no reason or mechanism why a feature of the consequent, in this case is probability, gets transposed to the antecedent via the conclusion. That is, the low probability of something occurring gets denied. This probability, if at all, gets denied on the second premise. There's no reason why a probabilistic consequent gives away that probability to an antecedent that was not in itself probabilistic. So it seems to me that this transposition of probability from the consequence to the antecedent via the conclusion is not warranted. Now, I must also concede that there may be a second explanation, and it's not that there is a logical mechanism that Wagenmakers et al. Are following to transpose the probability of the consequence onto the antecedent via the conclusion, but simply that they concluded in a manner that makes sense. I'll show you very quickly a syllogism here. And if we can see, this syllogism actually makes sense, its conclusion, even when there is no probability anywhere. So if we have the theory, the antecedent, that all swans are white, then we expect to see, we expect that any swan that we will see as a consequence will be also white. So if we see a bird that is not white, and we believe it's a swan, and we see that it's not white, we can conclude that probably the bird that we observe is not a swan. Now, this is formally illogical. That's not a conclusion that derived from the syllogism, from the Modus Tollens. But the probability conclusion actually makes sense in the sense that it accords to our experience, given that we are not very good in keeping logical formalisms anyway. And it may be this that explains why, or that may explain why Wagenmakers and other critics conclude a probabilistic statement when rather than they being using a probabilistic transposition. So that may be a second possibility of why the syllogisms end up with a probability when that antecedent itself is not probabilistic at all.